The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as students, teachers, and parents filled the seats, eager to hear the speeches from the finalists. Marcus Carter stood backstage, gripping his note cards tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his moment, the opportunity he had worked so hard for. His speech, Overcoming Adversity and Building the Future, wasn't just another assignment. It was a reflection of his journey, his struggles, and his unbreakable spirit. As Marcus took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, a familiar voice cut through the background noise. Mr. Thompson, his English teacher, leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Marcus, let's be honest," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You really think anyone's going to take you seriously? A speech about adversity? Come on, no one here wants a sob story." Marcus turned slowly, his grip on his note cards tightening. He had dealt with Mr. Thompson's dismissive attitude all year, his constant belittling, his skepticism about Marcus's abilities, his thinly veiled disdain. But tonight, Marcus wasn't going to let him win. "It's not a sob story, sir," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. "It's my story, and it's about hope, not pity." Mr. Thompson chuckled, shaking his head as if Marcus had just told him a joke. "You can dress it up however you like, but let's face it, you're just not meant for this kind of spotlight. Public speaking takes eloquence, sophistication, something you just don't have." Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing through the years of doubt, the moments of struggle, the voices that told him he wouldn't make it. But he had made it. He was standing here, about to speak in front of an entire auditorium. He had earned this moment. With a deep breath, Marcus lifted his chin and met Mr. Thompson's gaze. "Watch me!" The MC's voice rang out from the stage. "Next up, we have Marcus Carter." Applause echoed through the room as Marcus stepped forward, his heart now beating with determination rather than fear. He approached the microphone, his eyes scanning the audience, locking onto familiar faces, his mother, his friends, his community. People who believed in him, people who mattered. He took a deep breath and began. "Good evening, everyone. I stand here today as a testament to resilience, to the power of believing in yourself when others don't. Because adversity isn't a roadblock, it's the foundation for success." The room fell into a hush as his words resonated, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. The same students who had once overlooked him were now leaning in, listening, absorbing his every word. Parents nodded in approval, teachers exchanged glances of admiration. Even Mr. Thompson, standing in the back of the auditorium, seemed momentarily stunned. Marcus didn't just deliver a speech, he delivered a message, a declaration that no one could define his worth but himself. And as he finished, the room erupted into applause. Students stood, cheering him on. His mother wiped a tear from her eye, beaming with pride. The standing ovation wasn't just for his words, it was for his courage, his perseverance, his triumph. And in that moment, Marcus knew he had won. Not just the competition, but the battle against doubt, against stereotypes, against the voices that told him he wasn't enough. Because he was enough. He always had been. The auditorium was packed. Hundreds of students, teachers, and parents filled the seats, waiting for the senior speech competition to begin. The stage lights shone brightly as Marcus Carter stood at the podium, gripping the edges tightly. His heart pounded, but he steadied himself. He had prepared for this moment for weeks. This speech wasn't just words, it was a piece of his soul, a message about overcoming adversity and building the future. He took a deep breath, cleared his throat, and began. His voice rang out, clear and confident. Adversity is something we all face, but it doesn't define us. It shapes us. It pushes us towards something greater. The crowd listened, some nodding, others quietly absorbing his words. His mother sat in the second row, smiling proudly. But in the front row, just a few feet from the stage, Mr. Thompson sat with his arms crossed, shaking his head. At first, Marcus ignored him. He knew Mr. Thompson never believed in him. The man had spent years dismissing him in class, always acting as though Marcus wasn't capable of greatness. But Marcus wouldn't let that stop him today. "I stand before you not as someone who had everything handed to him, but as someone who worked twice as hard to prove that where you come from doesn't determine where you're going." A few students clapped softly, inspired by Marcus's words, but then a low, sarcastic chuckle came from the front row. It was Mr. Thompson. "What does this kid know about real adversity?" he muttered, not even bothering to lower his voice. Marcus hesitated for half a second. He heard it. So did the students sitting nearby. A few of them exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mr. Thompson wasn't done. "He's just playing the race card," he whispered to the teacher next to him, rolling his eyes. The whisper wasn't quiet enough. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as more students caught wind of the remark. Some gasped. A few looked around in disbelief. Did their own teacher just say that? Marcus felt it like a punch to the gut. His hands trembled slightly, gripping the podium tighter. The air in the auditorium shifted. A mix of disbelief, anger, and awkward tension settled in the room. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. Would he break? Would he let Mr. Thompson's words rattle him? Marcus inhaled deeply. Number. He refused to let this man take this moment away from him. He locked eyes with Mr. Thompson, his expression unreadable. Then, instead of responding with anger, he turned back to the audience and continued speaking, his voice even stronger than before. "Some people will tell you that your struggles aren't real, that your journey isn't difficult enough, that your success doesn't belong to you." Mr. Thompson's smirk faltered. "But let me tell you this. Adversity is not measured by how others see it. It's measured by how we overcome it. And that's exactly what I intend to do." The auditorium erupted in applause. Even the students who had been indifferent before were now clapping, standing up for Marcus in defiance of Mr. Thompson's comment. His mother, wiping away tears, stood up first, and one by one, other students and parents followed. A standing ovation. And at that moment, Mr. Thompson wasn't laughing anymore. The auditorium was silent. For a brief moment, Marcus wasn't sure how the audience would react. His heart pounded in his chest, his hands still gripping the edges of the podium. He had poured everything into this speech, his struggles, his dreams, his determination. He had stood tall despite the mockery, despite the whispers, despite the doubt. Then, from the middle of the auditorium, a single clap rang out. Marcus looked up. It was Samantha, a quiet girl from his class. She wasn't known for being outspoken, but there she was, standing up, clapping loudly. Another clap followed, then another, and before Marcus could process it, an entire row of students rose to their feet, applauding. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted into cheers. The sound was deafening. The students who had once dismissed him were now standing in solidarity. Teachers, parents, and even members of the school board rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the massive room. Marcus's mother, sitting in the front row, wiped a tear from her eye. Her son had just delivered a message that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson sat frozen in his seat. His smug expression had vanished. He hadn't expected this. He had thought his mocking remarks would go unnoticed, that his dismissal of Marcus's speech would be brushed aside, but the overwhelming reaction in the auditorium proved him wrong. Principal Reynolds, who had been watching from the side of the stage, stepped forward. He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his face filled with admiration. Then, turning toward the audience, he lifted a microphone. "Marcus," the principal said, his voice steady, "that was one of the most powerful speeches this school has ever seen." A fresh wave of cheers filled the room. "But," the principal continued, his voice shifting to something sterner, "it has also brought something else to light, something that cannot be ignored." The applause faded slightly, and the attention shifted, not toward Marcus, but toward Mr. Thompson. "Respect," Principal Reynolds continued, his gaze locking onto the teacher in question, "is something that should be encouraged in this school. Every student deserves to have their voice heard without fear of being belittled by the very educators who are meant to uplift them." Mr. Thompson stiffened in his seat. He shifted uncomfortably, realizing that all eyes were now on him. "I'd like to personally apologize to Marcus for what he just endured in this room," the principal continued, "and I think some others should be reconsidering their actions as well." The entire auditorium turned toward Mr. Thompson. The teacher swallowed hard, his face turning red. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control of the conversation. He opened his mouth as if searching for an excuse, but no words came out. He could feel the pressure of the moment settling in, the weight of his own ignorance crashing down on him. Marcus, however, wasn't looking for revenge. He didn't need Mr. Thompson's validation, the standing ovation, the overwhelming support from his peers, the moment of truth. That was all the proof he needed. Still standing at the podium, Marcus finally exhaled. He looked over at his classmates, the people who had once ignored his efforts, and smiled. He had won, not in the competition, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had once doubted him. The principal leaned into the mic one last time. "I think we've just witnessed something truly special today," he said, nodding at Marcus. "And I think it's time we all start listening a little more to voices like his." With that, Marcus stepped away from the podium. He had made his mark, and nothing, not even Mr. Thompson's doubt, could take that away from him. The room was still. Marcus stepped off the stage, his heart pounding, his hands slightly trembling. He wasn't nervous anymore, not after what had just happened, but he was overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. He had walked onto that stage as a student with something to prove. Now, he was walking off as someone who had changed the conversation entirely. Mrs. Edwards, the school principal, stood up, adjusting the microphone as she took center stage. She had been silent during the speech, watching everything unfold with careful attention. But now, her voice was strong, commanding the attention of everyone in the auditorium. "I want to take a moment," she began, "to acknowledge what we have just witnessed." She turned toward Marcus, offering him a nod of admiration. "Marcus, your words today were not just inspiring. They were a reminder of the power of perseverance and courage. They showed us what it truly means to stand tall in the face of doubt, and for that, you deserve respect." The audience erupted in cheers once more, students clapping and some even whistling in support. But the moment wasn't over yet. Mrs. Edwards shifted her gaze to the front row, where Mr. Thompson sat stiffly in his chair, his face pale, his eyes darting around the room. "And I believe," the principal continued, her voice now sharper, "that some of us here today need to reflect on what respect truly means." The air in the auditorium shifted. The cheers faded, replaced by an expectant silence. Every head turned to Mr. Thompson. The teacher, who had been so quick to mock Marcus only minutes earlier, now sat frozen under the weight of hundreds of stares. His smugness had vanished, replaced by uncertainty. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat, as though looking for a way out. Mrs. Edwards didn't give him one. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her tone unyielding, "I believe you owe Marcus, and every student in this room, an apology." A chill ran through the room. For the first time in his career, Mr. Thompson wasn't in control. He was being held accountable. He swallowed hard, glancing around at the students. Many of them, including those who had laughed at Marcus before, were now looking at him with expectation. He had no choice. Mr. Thompson hesitated, his voice unsteady. He took a deep breath and finally muttered, "I was wrong." The room remained silent, waiting. "I let my bias and my arrogance cloud my judgment," he continued, his voice quieter now. "Marcus, you deserved better. You deserve respect, and I should have given it to you." His words hung in the air. Marcus, standing off to the side, felt a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to dismiss the apology, to reject the idea that a few forced words could erase the disrespect. But another part of him knew that this moment was bigger than just him. This wasn't just about Mr. Thompson's apology. This was about a shift, a moment when a student, a black student who had been underestimated, dismissed, and mocked, stood his ground and forced the world to listen. The days following the speech felt surreal. Marcus had always been just another student in the halls of Westbridge High, until now. Now, he wasn't just Marcus Carter, the kid who worked hard. Now, he was Marcus Carter, the kid who made history. Everywhere he walked, students stopped him, some who had never spoken to him before, to shake his hand, to congratulate him, to thank him. "Dude, that was legendary," one of the football players said, clapping him on the back. "I've never seen anyone shut down a teacher like that before." "I sent the video to my cousin," another student admitted. "She said she showed her whole college class." Marcus barely knew what to say. His words had meant something. At first, he hadn't even realized the full impact of what had happened that day. But then the video surfaced. Someone had recorded the entire exchange, from Marcus standing tall behind the podium to Mr. Thompson's forced apology. The clip spread across social media like wildfire. Within hours, students from other schools started sharing it. Within days, local news stations were reaching out to Marcus, wanting to interview him about his experience. His inbox was flooded with messages, some from strangers, some from community leaders, and even a few from civil rights organizations who wanted to highlight his story as an example of courage in the face of bias. His name was everywhere. At first, it was overwhelming. Marcus had never sought out attention. He had never imagined that his one speech, his one moment of standing his ground, would become something bigger than just a school assembly. But now, it was, and for the first time, Marcus realized he had a voice, and people were listening. One afternoon, as he was packing up his books after class, his English teacher, not Mr. Thompson, but another teacher, Ms. Ramirez, approached him. "You know, Marcus," she said, leaning against the desk, "what you did wasn't just about a speech. You challenged something bigger." Marcus looked up, curious. "What do you mean?" Ms. Ramirez smiled. "For years, students like you have been underestimated. You reminded everyone that intelligence, leadership, and power aren't determined by race, background, or expectations. You changed something in this school, Marcus, and I think you're just getting started." Her words sat with him for days, because she was right. This wasn't just about a school assembly. This was about breaking stereotypes, about showing young black boys, kids like him, that they could stand up, be heard, and make a difference. Marcus took a deep breath as he looked at the messages flooding his phone. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a symbol, and he wasn't going to waste this opportunity. The energy in the school had shifted. Marcus could feel it the moment he stepped into the hallways. People weren't just whispering about the assembly anymore. They were talking about real things, about real problems that had been ignored for far too long. For the first time, the school wasn't just brushing issues under the rug. They were facing them head-on. On Friday, the gymnasium was packed. Every student, every teacher, every administrator was there. The principal stood at the podium, but this wasn't just another speech. There was something different in her eyes, something determined, something serious. She cleared her throat. "I want to start by saying something that should have been said a long time ago," she began. "To Marcus, and to every student who has ever felt unheard or underestimated, I'm sorry. We failed you, and today that changes." The silence was deafening. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just an empty gesture. This was real. The principal continued, her voice steady. "We will be making real changes to ensure that every student, regardless of background, race, or identity, feels valued in this school. She turned toward the panel of teachers sitting behind her. Starting today, all staff members will undergo cultural sensitivity and bias training. We will not tolerate discrimination in our classrooms, not from students and not from teachers. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't just a speech. This was action. A few seats away, Mr. Thompson sat rigid, his usual smugness nowhere to be seen. The principal wasn't finished. We will also be forming a student-led diversity council, one that will help shape school policies, address issues of bias, and ensure that every student has a voice. She paused, then turned toward Marcus. And we would like Marcus Carter to be one of its founding members. A stunned silence hung in the air. Then applause erupted. Marcus blinked, overwhelmed, as his classmates stood, clapping for him, cheering him on. This wasn't just about his speech anymore. It was bigger than him. It was about every student who had ever been dismissed, every kid who had been mocked for daring to dream. As Marcus stood up, locking eyes with the principal, he knew one thing for certain. His voice had changed something, and for the first time in a long time, he truly felt like he belonged. The auditorium was packed, the air buzzing with excitement as graduates adjusted their caps, waiting for their names to be called. Marcus sat among them, his hands resting on his lap, his mind drifting back to the moment that had changed everything. It felt like a lifetime ago. The speech, the humiliation, the applause, the moment he found his voice. Now, he wasn't just another student sitting in the crowd. He was walking proof that one voice could make a difference. The principal stood at the podium, her voice carrying across the room. And now, it is my honor to introduce someone who has not only excelled academically, but has left a lasting impact on this school. Someone who reminded us all that courage, resilience, and the power to change the world can start in the most unexpected ways. Marcus lifted his head as the principal smiled directly at him. Marcus Carter, please come forward. A wave of applause surged through the auditorium. Marcus exhaled, his heartbeat steady as he rose from his seat. He walked toward the stage, passing row after row of classmates who once dismissed him, underestimated him, ignored him. But today, they cheered for him. He reached the podium, shaking the principal's hand as she handed him his diploma. The weight of it felt heavier than just a piece of paper. It was proof that he belonged, proof that he had been heard, proof that his story mattered. As he turned to face the audience, his eyes scanned the crowd, locking onto his mother's proud, tear-filled gaze. Then, he looked at the rows of students sitting where he had once sat. Kids who had their own battles, their own fears, their own voices waiting to be heard. And he smiled, because he knew this was just the beginning.